Hi class, this is Dr. Pete, and as we reach the end of the first couple of units, I wanted to take a few minutes to reflect on some of the things that we've been studying and try to tie all the concepts together for you. I know that the first couple of chapters have thrown a lot of terms at you, and it's almost probably like learning a new language, so let's see if we can make some sense of it. To do this, I want to focus on the two discussion questions that I asked you in the second unit. But before we get into those, to answer those, let's look at the purpose of the course and make sure that we understand that what we're trying to do is to try to figure out why groups succeed or fail. And if we can explain and predict under what circumstances groups will succeed or fail, then we have a better chance of ourselves having more productive and more enjoyable group experiences. And I know we've all been in the groups that have failed for some reason, and it's been a miserable experience for one reason or another, and we just don't want to do that anymore. So let's look at this chart that's similar to the one that's in your textbook. Along the top you see two options for understanding. Either we understand why a group succeeds or fails, and that's represented in this column, or we don't know why a group works or doesn't work, and that's represented here in this column. And then for the outcome, we have really two options. Either our group can succeed or it can be a failure, however we define that. So if we put these two conditions together, the best situation for us is to be in a group that's successful and we understand why. And the reason is that now that we understand what are the mix of circumstances that led to that success, we can replicate it in the future. On the other hand, if we're successful but we don't know why, we can't recreate that. We can't be certain, or at least have a higher expectation of having a good group experience. And so for that reason, as a student of group communication, this is not as valuable a set of circumstances for us. Down here, this is the worst of all possible worlds. We have a bad group experience, a group failure, and we don't know why. And that's where we've been before, when groups seem arbitrary and capricious, and we don't enjoy them, and so we don't ever want to be back in one again. Over here, in this square, if the group doesn't succeed, if the group fails, but we know why, well, we've learned something from that, and we know not to have a particular mix of factors in the future, that if we can avoid certain factors in the group, that we can make it more successful. So what the purpose of this course is to get everything preferably in this square, but at least in this column. So if we're not successful, at least we understand why we succeed or we fail to succeed, so we can recreate that in the future. Now with that in mind, let's look at the first discussion question, which was for us to define small group communication. And I asked you to come up with a list of factors that you thought related to small group communication. In other words, what were those factors that have to be present for us to be communicating in a small group? And that's important because if everything is a small group, then we really can't predict and explain success and failure. It's too big. And if nothing fits in there, well, it's not a special circumstance and there's no point in studying it. So let's try to find out what are those circumstances that in particular define what happens in a small group. The first one is that you need to have about 3 to 20 participants. And there's a different explanation for that at both ends of it. At the small end, 3 have to be present. 2 doesn't work for a group, and the reason is groups work off of peer pressure and power. In other words, once you have 3 people, we can begin to form political factions so that 2 people can basically gang up on the other person and move them in a particular direction. Or the peer pressure that's exerted by 2 people over 1 is much more influential. That is much more likely to move someone towards participating in the group or towards conforming to the group than one-on-one. So at the other end, 20 participants, there's no magic in that. In other words, having 19 is a group, 20 may or may not be a group, 21 may or may not be a group. The issue is mutual influence. Does every member of the group have the opportunity to be influential over every other member? And that's essential if we're going to utilize this peer pressure and political power in a group. So somewhere around 20, we begin to move away from having that mutual influence, and so at that point we would probably say we're not participating in a small group. The second criterion is that we have to have symbolic behavior, which is a fancy way of saying we need to have communication. Because if we have a collection of people, but they're not interacting in any way, certainly they're not a group, right? They have to have some sort of communication so that they can coordinate their behavior. The third criterion for a group is that we have to have shared goals. Not the same goals, but there has to be overlap. So in other words, if you and I are participating in a group and I have my own reasons for being there and some of those reasons match yours and every other member of the group, then there's a reason for us to interact. Okay? If my goals are totally different than yours, why would I participate in a group with you? Of course it's going to be a punishing experience for me, and the same for you. So we need to make sure that we have shared goals, and this begins to tell us how do we move a group towards more effective behavior? Well, first thing is make sure that you have common goals, some issues that you share, something that you all want to move to, because if not, then those participants are not the right people to be in that group. The next criterion, and I think the most important, is interdependence. And this is the idea that we all succeed or fail together. In other words, we sink or swim together, like a team. If a basketball team goes out and plays and they lose, they all lose. It's not a situation where some people win and some people lose. The group has to have one outcome that applies to everybody. And again, this is the key factor in making a group interact in a positive way. In our Western society, we tend to push people away when we don't like what's going on instead of drawing them to greater interdependence. In other words, if you depend on me more, okay, you're more likely to participate in a way that I would like you to, because your success depends on it. This is a good reason why in other classes where you've worked in a group but the instructor has made it so that everybody receives their own grade, the group typically fails because you're not interdependent. You ask yourself, why would I work with this other person? Why would I give them the benefit of my hard work for them to get a grade? Okay, because it has no effect on me. On the other hand, if we benefit from each other, okay, if we're interdependent, if we sink or swim together, then there's a lot of reason for us to work as a group. And finally, I put the characteristic of openness, and really what this represents is that the group is a member of many other subgroups, greater groups, supergroups, and subgroups, and that the group shares information with the environment. In other words, this is all the stuff that you read about in terms of systems theory. The group takes in something from the environment, it does something to that information or raw materials or whatever the group is processing, and then it produces a product. And so that's essential for a group to function. If it's closed, it's not really going to function with some of these characteristics that we've laid out. So these are the characteristics that I believe are essential to small group communication, and I think whenever these characteristics exist, we can use these characteristics to begin to move us towards more positive group experiences. And further, we can see that when these characteristics exist, we will study a whole host of other tools this semester that we can use to also move the group in a more positive direction. On the other hand, if one of these characteristics doesn't exist, we're not likely to really be in an effective small group communication situation. So if we want to be there, if we want to function as a group, then we have to work to build these. Having said that, then let's look at the second discussion question. Is our class a small group? And I looked at this two ways. The first way I looked at it is the whole class, and I would say no. Our whole class is not a small group because we are certainly not interdependent, and many of the times we may not have all the other characteristics that I just mentioned. In other words, you don't sink or swim together. You all get your own grades, you all have your own outcomes from the class, and because of that, you don't really rely heavily, if at all, on the other members of the class. And certainly in most self-paced classes, you wouldn't rely on anybody at all. Now that brings me to the second circumstance. When we break up into subgroups starting next week, you will be, each of your small groups your subgroups, excuse me, will be a small group because you'll be interdependent many times. That is, I'll be giving your small group the same grade for the work project you produce. Okay? So I hope that clarifies for you some of the key features that you've studied. We want to be able to know when we are working in a small group, because then we can decide what tools do we have to make the group more productive. And we know what times are we not in a small group, because then we need to look to some other aspect of communication to help us be more productive. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.